So I guess it's around time. Numbers have been pretty constant. So welcome everybody once again. 12 it is, Neuro Talk Evening 12. Today with Dr. Ondrej Zika from the University College of Dublin. And today's topic is the role of uncertainty in uncertainty aversion in mental health. And just to take you along a real quick, short introduction on who today's presenter is. He just recently became an assistant professor at the University of Dublin back in the end of 2025. And before that, he studied for bachelor's marketing and psychology and skipped the master's section to immediately go to Oxford and become do clinical neuroscience PhD there. Then he also was an ERC fellow at the University of Bielefeld, research scientist at the Karolinska Institute, and also he spent some time at the Max Planck Institute at a postdoc. His research focus mainly is facing uncertainty in everyday decision and the relation to psychopathology. And one thing that you could consider his most notable work, if you want to search for something like that, this might be trait anxiety is associated with hidden state inference during aversive planning. His current studies focus on longitudinal analysis of clinical data and modeling from types of uncertainty, and both fit in pretty well. So to now get or shift towards the topic, today's topic is, so uncertainty acts as a foundational driver of mental health struggles and is often related to anxiety. But how can we really access this? And how can we effectively process those data to improve clinical interventions? And this is where I would like to end my part of the presentation and hand over to you, Ondrej.
Hey, thank you, Sebastian, for the introduction. I will start sharing my screen, just a sec. Yes, it's a great pleasure to be here. I am quite excited to discuss all these different aspects of uncertainty with you today. I have to give you a little warning. I've fallen sick yesterday, so I'm in a recovery mode a little bit. So I'm ready with my tea, and sometimes my voice is sort of flipping, but it's hopefully going to be okay. So today, essentially, what I was thinking of covering is I would like to first sort of set the scene a little bit. So just discuss different aspects of uncertainty, just discuss the topic, and maybe also get a bit of your thoughts about what you think when you think about uncertainty. I will mention a few things about how uncertainty is involved in mental health. And then I will pause a little bit for like an interim questions in case there are any. And then I will move to actual examples of our research, so things we have been working on in the context of anxiety in particular. And then I've received a lot of your questions. So I've actually pasted them into the slides, and we can sort of have a look at them, and I'll try to answer maybe some of them to maybe this will kind of also spin a conversation. But yeah, I really liked your questions because they were slightly different than what I usually sometimes think about. So it made me also think about certain aspects that wouldn't always be on my day-to-day research agenda, which I always really like. Great. So I guess I have a participatory question at the beginning, which is I'm kind of curious when people talk about uncertainty, like what is it that you imagine when people, when somebody asks you, like, do you like uncertainty? What is it that comes to your mind? I'm curious.
I mean, for those of you who would like to give an answer and that, just use the raise your hand function here on Zoom.
Yeah.
I
Also
mean,
type in the chat is also fine. It's just like,
I guess there's one clear.
yeah. Do I have to do anything?
Oh, no. I mean, I mentioned him and he also unmuted himself, but I don't hear anything so far.
I see.
Lirum, are you talking right now? So in case we can't hear you, yes, that's the case for all three of us.
Yeah.
If it doesn't work, you can also type it in the chat and then I just read it out. Might take a short time. And to cover this time, I could give just my interpretation of what I understand with the subject of uncertainty. Um, I mean, I do basically, I would describe it as a modulating factor, right? Something that, yeah, really covers or affects a lot of processes and decisions in everyday life, and that may or may not come in certain situations. So it will be triggered due to different factors that are set to the environment, right? So in certain situations.
Yeah, yeah, I was asking this question because I'm sort of curious what comes to people's mind first when they think about uncertainty, kind of thinking that maybe we all have different sort of worries or maybe things we focus on. But of course, the truth is that it's the key thing about studying uncertainty is that it's very ubiquitous. And what this means is that it's present in every aspect of our life, essentially, of both like our personal lives, but also scientific lives. So I think everybody probably in the audience who has ever analyzed any data or has done anything has in some way had to deal with uncertainty, right? And it's just this ubiquity. So it's kind of this ever-present layer that basically should be considered in our analyses because, and not just analyses, but in our case when we develop cognitive models, because it's just something that by the mere nature of the world, there are imperfections. And the fact that there are imperfections in our observations, in our how we understand others, means that this is something that should be always explicitly included in our understanding of whatever our scientific endeavor is. And I think one of my motivations is that the fact that this is not sometimes the case, right? So sometimes you have sort of approaches or certain theories which disregard this component, only for someone to later kind of come with a revolutionary new idea which incorporates uncertainty into something where it should have been incorporated in the first place, essentially. So it's just to say that this is a very ubiquitous process.
And there are
Um,
also, oh,
yeah.
sorry, didn't want to interrupt you. There are a few more things in the chat. And also there was one more raised hand, but I just really quickly read out what's written in the chat. One person mentioned, Kalin, and this mean we dislike uncertainty. And
Mm.
then the second one is from Ashkuna. For example, going on vacation without having everything planned out. And then Andre, you raised your hand, but you took it down again. Would you like to add something, or is everything already mentioned?
Yeah, I think it was already mentioned, but I was still curious that if you think it makes sense even talking about uncertainty outside of the sphere of perception.
Yes. Yes. So I will now follow with an example where I will talk about different aspects of uncertainty where perception is just one of them, essentially. So maybe let's get to this example, which, sorry, this should have popped out one thing at a time, but due to my yesterday's indisposition, I wasn't able to quite get it finished. But if you imagine, somebody mentioned planning holiday, but you can also plan a journey from your home to your work, and you might have to decide, which transport mode you take, essentially. And there might be some sort of uncertainty about when will you actually reach the goal. So this would be something called like outcome uncertainty, for example. But there might also be, uncertainty about the current state of, this is actually a picture of Berlin. So there might be current state of the traffic in Berlin. Maybe it's Sunday or maybe there's works. And so there's this kind of state dependence of the current model of the world, essentially. And this is again just to demonstrate this point that there is really unpredictability which comes from quite a few different sources. And of course, the common one that people sort of look at quite a lot is the perceptual, which I also included here. So maybe you look at the clock, or maybe it's foggy, or maybe your roommate has burned a pizza and now there's smoke everywhere, so you can't see the clock for whatever reason. Um, so you experience perceptual uncertainty. And I guess this is the sort of point that I'm trying to make, that um, you know, there's imperfections in every sort of physical system. And so this will always inherently gives rise to uncertainty. Would that answer your question that you had? Or point?
Me or?
Somebody mentioned something about perceptual uncertainty a moment ago.
Oh, yeah, but yeah, I think I was just referring to perceptual uncertainty wrong there, because what I was trying to say is, since our uncertainty is perceived so different for everyone, right? It's so individualized in a sense. If it even makes sense, I mean, I'm trying a bit to go into this direction of the like a more philosophical debate on solipsism. If it even makes sense talking about any other kind of uncertainty than the one that is perceived by everyone in particular.
Yeah, and in fact, I would say that uncertainty, at least what the word means specifically, is almost always subjective. There is objective stochasticity or objective unpredictability or objective volatility. These are features of the environment, but the perception, so I see what you mean by the perception now. The fact that uncertainty is inherently on the part of the observer, which makes it subjective. I think that's a view that I would pretty much subscribe to, yes. With this in mind, because it's ubiquitous, it's also kind of difficult to study, right? Because everything you might be interested in, for example, planning behaviors, like in our case, or generalization behaviors, you should always try to consider, what is the component of uncertainty in these kind of mental cognitive sort of approaches. And that being said, people have done made some effort to try to kind of build a more structural approaches to understanding uncertainty. This is one paper that has gone in this direction, which has focused on the process of how we're sort of learning about an upcoming goal or planning our actions. So we have some sensory perception. Again, if it's foggy, we're not sure what the color of the light might be. We then form, there might be some uncertainty about the current state of the world. My example that I like to give is, for example, you might want to be aware whether you're currently in Germany or whether you're in Ireland, because you'll probably want to know that if you're driving. There might be different rules. There might be different sort of causal models that currently govern the world. So once you integrate your own internal state with external state, you might want to sort of consider what is the actual probability of something happening under these models. And then there's, of course, the sort of outcome uncertainty. So what's the likelihood of a certain outcome? And this is kind of an interesting approach, but I still find it quite limiting because it really is quite specific to certain situations. So is there anything kind of meaningful about, or can we organize uncertainty in any meaningful way? Or should we just basically say we are interested in cognitive processes, and basically every cognitive process has some uncertainty, or every, I guess, quantity has some uncertainty attached to it, right? Which would be sort of a logical approach in a way. And that would sort of make sense, but there is actually some aspects of uncertainty or types of events that happen in the world, which it's worth thinking about, I would say. And the biggest distinction is the difference between uncertainty which has arisen due to some form of stochastic process or some true randomness in the world, versus some uncertainty which is just due to lack of our knowledge, right? Maybe we're new to a certain environment, so we're not fully familiar with how things work. Like if you consider, I don't know, trains, for example, there's some sort of stochasticity, which, basically is just sort of randomness. Although the philosophers among you will now say, well, the stochasticity really occurs only at some really low levels, but I think there is such thing as sort of practical stochasticity. And this is sometimes too referred to as aleatoric uncertainty. This comes, of course, from the alea, from the Latin word for the dice. And this is basically meant to communicate situations where where things only happen due to randomness. So if we flip a coin or roll a dice, or maybe we are facing some kind of gamble proposition, like in this case, where there's a given probability that we will lose 10 pounds and given probability we'll win 20 pounds. And one interesting aspect, and I'll talk about this in a second, is that this uncertainty, we cannot really reduce it through our actions. So it's inherently irreducible. The second aspect of uncertainty, or second type of uncertainty, is sometimes known as epistemic uncertainty. And the epistemic, again, it comes from lack of knowledge about a certain aspect of the world, right? So if I continue with the previous example, if I now cover this bar showing the probabilities with some screen, I've introduced something which is known as ambiguity, which means that you don't know exactly now what the probability would be. And this generates uncertainty, which you could reduce. Maybe you could try to remove this barrier, or you could take some actions. And of course, this is the map of Berlin is a nice example, right? So people in East Berlin or East Germany during the Cold War, they couldn't really go to the West, so it was a bit of a black box, even though it was technically possible. So it was definitely not aleatoric. It was not due to some chance, but it was definitely due to lack of knowledge. But you might say things like, well, if we think about the coin flip, imagine if we had actually a really precise camera, right? And we know perfectly the conditions. Wouldn't that sort of turn this aleatoric uncertainty into epistemic, right? So wouldn't it become a problem of lack of knowledge, essentially? Or if, for example, we're studying some perceptual thresholds, and we just again use some better sensor. Suddenly, uncertainty, which was aleatoric or irreducible, becomes possibly reducible. And I guess this is true for anything up till a sort of certain really, really low level quantum phenomena, where I think that's the only time we can really talk about true aleatoric uncertainty. So why do I still think that this distinction is helpful? Of course, there are practical limitations to our everyday life. So in everyday life, there are such things occurring with us being unable to reduce this uncertainty. So there's such thing as we can sort of give them the label of aleatoric, because there's really objectively nothing we can do within the constraints of our daily lives. I've been talking about this concept of reusability, and I actually find it somewhat more informative and a bit more practical in a way, because it basically asks the agent, is there something you can do to reduce the uncertainty? And I've already said that the aleatoric uncertainty is always irreducible, but actually epistemic uncertainty can also be irreducible, right? So what is Donald Trump thinking right now? I could theoretically go into the, find a way into his mind and discover this. And it seems like somebody has actually done that, because before he launched the war in Iran, of course, some people have speculated on the markets very heavily that this will happen within 5 minutes before it actually happened. So somebody has this access, but not me. So this is not uncertainty I can reduce. But most epistemic uncertainty in our life or in our world is actually reducible. And I guess then the question becomes, how much effort or how much resources are we willing to invest into reducing this uncertainty? There could also be something that's preventing us, right? So there could be some barrier from reducing the uncertainty. And then in particular in psychology, we are interested in what people perceive these barriers to be, right? Is there maybe some latent fear? Maybe people don't want to approach certain aversive situation to reduce uncertainty. Maybe this could be things like, I don't want to file my taxes because I don't want to know how much the taxes will end up being, right? So there might be psychological barriers to reducing uncertainty. So I've kind of talked about this a little bit. I will just show this as an example. What's interesting for us as psychologists, and particularly in the context of mental health, is like, let's say there's an objective component of irreducible uncertainty in the world, right? So let's take tossing the coin. What we really care about is how does the person actually perceive the situation? If we know that there's some ground truth within the context of the setting, does the person perceive the situation or the possibility as being actually reducible, even though it is irreducible in fact? But also the other way around, there could be a situation which is reducible, but it is perceived as irreducible, right? So there's a sort of mismatch between some semi-objective state of the external world and how the agent or the person perceives it. And I think this is an interesting problem because it gives rise to things like, for example, in OCD, it's a very common behavior that people try to sort of engage in a lot of checking behaviors, right? So one of the proposed ideas is that this is somewhat related to this idea where people will try to really minimize the uncertainty or the state of the knowledge beyond what's even sometimes possible, right? This could be things like excessive checking behaviors. If you're, for example, waiting for a train and there's some stochasticity in the train arrival, but you keep kind of refreshing your app excessively, which is of course quite detrimental, can be distressing. But this is just an example how you perceive the uncertainty can directly be linked to sort of symptoms of mental health. The one interesting aspect that's often somewhat kind of not really attended too much, at least historically, is the fact that we never really know, how much randomness there is. We are very bad as humans actually at assessing randomness. I'll talk about this in a second. I think you might have heard examples. And we try to find patterns in the world because obviously that's an adaptive feature. Try to find patterns to be able to make better predictions. And actually, if you find a correct pattern, you manage to reduce the uncertainty, right? Like you manage to build a model of how things work, maybe what the other person is thinking, etc. But what can also happen is that we try to sort of overfit the data that we are observing. So what I mean by that is we can also sometimes kind of see patterns, even though that they were not really there. And the example I show here is, let's say you see the sequence of numbers and there's 3, 2, 5, which occurs twice, quite close to each other, right? So is it reasonable to assume that there's this hidden pattern? Because if indeed every time you see 3 and 2, the next number was 5, that would be a really beneficial way to know, right? This would help you to sort of reduce the uncertainty by generating the right model or like having the right pattern. But humans, maybe because they are so kind of prone to, or for some reason, humans are quite likely to always search for patterns, even if these are not always correct. And I want to kind of put a pin on this idea of finding patterns in noisy scenarios, because we're going to talk about this in the second part. I also want to mention how this sort of mistreating epistemic and aleatoric uncertainty is one for the other, how this can sort of map onto maybe some behavioral manifestations that are related to mental health. If you, for example, treat epistemic uncertainty, so reducible, let's say, as aleatoric, you might, for example, not seek information. You might think, well, everything that's happening is due to chance, and you might sort of, not take any action to reduce this uncertainty. And clinically, this might lead to situations like avoidance, right? So you might then sort of avoid because you think that there's nothing to reduce, but perhaps there might be still. On the other hand, if you think that something which is truly just random and you treat it as if it was carrying some meaning, some signal, this can also be quite counterproductive because it might leave you feeling quite hopeless because you're trying to reduce some uncertainty, but you're not quite succeeding. And this would probably be something like checking behaviors. For those of you working with sort of AI and or has any fitted any model whatsoever, you have surely come across the concept of underfitting and overfitting. And essentially, this is exactly what these two examples are, right? So if you're underfitting, your model is sort of not quite capturing. It's kind of too simple to capture the nuances in the data, or you can also overfit, which means that you're kind of over explaining the data, but that prevents you from meaningfully generalize to unseen situations. One aspect of this is so how do we make this sort of judgments, right? So how do we sort of attribute whether a surprising event that we've just experienced was due to chance or whether it actually carries some signal? Now, this is, of course, a difficult problem. Those of you working with machine learning models will know that we try to solve this problem, but it's not always easy. I can give you an example here. So if you're going through like a series of outcomes which are at some excuse me, some level, and suddenly you get a surprising outcome, this can sort of be a change point event, which means that there's some shift in the state in the environment, and now this new level has come to be, and then there's another shift, etc. But this could also just be an oddball event, like a surprising outcome. And we can sort of look at these events in experiments, for example, to infer about the beliefs that the individual currently holds about the state of the environment, right? The other thing where attribution becomes interesting is in sort of daily interactions. I like this example of kind of social interactions where, you meet somebody or you have a conversation and the person does something slightly odd, like gives you a look or maybe answers in a strange way for some reason. And then your mind sort of gets thinking like, are they angry with me? Have I done something? Have I forgotten their birthday? There's like, and this is something that people with anxiety are particularly prone with, right? So anxiety is characterized by this pattern of overthinking, where basically you go through a process of planning out, laying out for yourself all the different possibilities, even though they are extremely, extremely unlikely. And this can again be quite overwhelming. I've mentioned this. I think this is a nice book. I don't know if anybody knows it, but it's essentially about the fact that we as humans often try to find signal in noise predominantly. There are some nice examples in the book about successful people often attributing their success to their skill rather than chance. But actually, there are also there's some nice work in economics kind of showing the contribution of chance versus skill to success. And it's important to recognize that the contribution of chance is much bigger than the skill, right? Within a certain overall. So this would take situations like, where was I born, being chance essentially. So it's quite an interesting read. I just wanted to recommend. Okay, so next I will talk about yet different naming for uncertainty, and that's just because it's something that comes up a lot in literature, and you might see papers that use this type of naming. So I thought I would just mention it and give you an example of how this plays out during a learning process. So people sometimes talk about something known as expected uncertainty. And this is basically if you have some variability in outcomes, some stochastic source, for example, most of it is due to some chance. So this is mainly aleatoric uncertainty. Although there can also be an epistemic component, but let's sort of put that aside. Then there's this term called unexpected uncertainty, and what people mean when they use that is when you have a change in the environment. So if environment suddenly changes, you're experiencing this sudden surprise, which generates unexpected uncertainty. So this can be things like being in volatile environments. And the other thing, and the last one is again epistemic, and this is if you're in a new environment, you might be uncertain about how the environment operates. So you might have this initial kind of ignorance about the rules of the environment. And this is something that you can reduce through experiences. And that's called estimation uncertainty. Here's an example of how this could play out during learning. So imagine that you are, this is not the best depiction, but imagine that you have two kind of sources. One source is producing sort of stochastic events, so there's some variability, but the mean is kind of fixed. And then imagine a second source, which is kind of shifting between different sources. So this could be things like rewards, or it could be things like, I don't know, um, how well you do in some game, etc. And so we can sort of demonstrate these three types of uncertainty on this sort of problem. First, we have this kind of Q, which I would call volatile here, which is, the true mean is actually shifting, but there is still some noise kind of around it. And then there's this purely sort of stochastic source, which is just has a fixed mean. So here, if you think about these three different types of uncertainty, you would basically have, if we just look at the red one now, you have some estimation uncertainty initially because you're not sure, how much the variability is of the specific source. But through some experiences and through some learning, you can kind of reduce this uncertainty. And at some point, you kind of reach the level of the pure stochasticity, right? At some point, you figure out that there's some degree of variability, which is sort of irreducible, and you have to sort of accept it. And I denoted here as the noise level, essentially. And the second, sorry, the expected uncertainty here would be basically this red bar, which is the variability that I've just described to you. Then we have something called unexpected uncertainty, which is driven by these shifts in the true mean, right? So on the blue, on the top here, you can see that here the mean suddenly shifts, and this generates this kind of spike of unexpected uncertainty. So I thought I would introduce these, as I said, because these come up in papers and you might come across them rather than these terms that I've been using before, aleatoric and epistemic uncertainty, which are actually less common in psychology. Okay, I have a few more slides on the introduction side, even though I know it's taking a bit longer. The other question is sort of how do we then respond to uncertainty? So let's say we are in a process where we have estimated uncertainty, and then the question is, how do we, what do we do about it? I've already hinted at the fact that sometimes we can seek information. So we can try to reduce uncertainty by, looking at our maps, calling somebody, looking at TikTok, whatever you really need, can be helpful in reducing uncertainty. And here I want to mention this distinction that people who study information seeking have made, which is that you can have there are two types of information seeking called instrumental and non-instrumental. So if you seek information, usually you do it because you want to gain some information or gain some reward. This is what's usually known as instrumental information seeking. So there's some instrumental value to your actions. The other type of information seeking is non-instrumental, and this is cases where you look for information or you find out, you look at something, even though that doesn't really improve your state of the world, it doesn't give you an immediate benefit. And I just thought I would mention this because the distinction is sort of intuitive, but if you really think about it, I also find it somewhat problematic because if you, for example, are just checking, there's one example of people playing a game where they could kind of see how their fictitious portfolio was doing. They kept sort of checking the state of the portfolio, even though this was not really, they couldn't do anything about it. And my argument would be, yes, but maybe in the future, the fact that they understand the fluctuations actually becomes instrumental, right? So it's very difficult to have a pure non-instrumental information seeking case. The other thing that relates to uncertainty quite closely is what actions we take. If you, for example, are, if you are a boat and you have to gather some resources on different islands, how do you sort of decide which island to go to, right? So you might, for example, go to the one which has the best apples. So here I've just plotted some distributions of again, imaginary rewards. Maybe this one has actually really good apples. I mean, it says 40, so actually they're not the best, but that's whatever. but also some islands you have kind of less information about, right? So do you also kind of explore a little bit to reduce this uncertainty? And this is something that's sometimes known as kind of exploration or exploitation. Like, do you stick to what you know, or do you sort of explore a little bit and gather some additional information? And there are kind of two types of exploration that have been put forward. One is called directed exploration. So this would be when you take an action to the island that you know the least about, essentially. So there's some high uncertainty about the red island. So this is when you would go and explore there with your ship. But you can also imagine a scenario of random exploration. You might have a exploration which is driven by just the necessity to sort of gather new information, or by things like, for example, novelty, right? So you could basically just have a tendency to randomly sometimes sample different islands. And of course, your beliefs about uncertainty play a key role here, right? Because why would you, for example, engage in exploratory behavior about an island where you have reduced all the uncertainty, right? Now there's only some stochasticity left, so actually there isn't really a reason to engage in exploration. I'm getting towards the end of this section, so I just want to mention how uncertainty now has been studied in the context of clinical psychology. And one thing, if you Google uncertainty or uncertainty aversion, that will for sure come up is this questionnaire, which is called Intolerance of Uncertainty Scale. And this has been developed by clinical psychologists in the 90s, especially by people who are studying worry and anxiety. And what they did essentially is they tried to isolate this tendency that they saw in a lot of the patients, that they really don't like uncertainty, and they find it quite aversive. And so this has been distilled into these 27 questions. There's also a shorter version, which is only 12 of these items. And there's been, as you can imagine, when people get really focused on something, there are also these wars between what's the actual kind of latent structure of this questionnaire. But I won't go too much into it. But all I want to say that the main instrument that people use to measure general tendency to find uncertainty aversive is this questionnaire. Now, considering everything that I've just told you up till now, you would be thinking, well, what type of uncertainty is it measuring? And the answer is, we don't know. And the second answer is, we cannot really know in a way, because if you, for example, read, I don't know, one of the questions, it really depends on how does the individual interpret the specific statement. If you ask them about uncertainty, do they perceive it as something that's aleatoric or something that's a bit more epistemic, right? So it really depends on how the individual actually interprets. I'm now actually trying to put together a project where we look at this more systematically, like how people actually interpret these different items, and how they sort of how that actually impacts their behavior on tasks where we can measure their aleatoric and epistemic estimation tendencies. The one thing about intolerance of uncertainty, which is actually quite interesting, I find, is that it's something that we see not just in anxiety, but in a lot of mental health disorders. So, including things like depression, OCD, things even in eating disorders, for example, and also neurological conditions, like even in autism, for example. And this has led people to propose that intolerance of uncertainty is actually more like a transdiagnostic factor. So this means that it spans different specific traditional diagnoses. And I find this quite helpful because we really do see this tendency to find uncertainty aversive across a lot of different conditions. I will skip this slide actually. I will only say that there are some links between anxiety and the how we estimate aleatoric and epistemic uncertainty. I think this paper on the right, I will just mention very, very briefly, where they basically used this kind of decision-making paradigm, and using a computational model, they could infer the individual estimation of stochasticity and volatility. So stochasticity would be, aleatoric beliefs, our beliefs about the randomness, and volatility would be the changes in the environment, so more epistemic. And they basically found that anxious people tend to treat noise as if they tend to perceive environment as more volatile, even though they're noisy. So they tend to find signal in a lot of noise. I think that's kind of a nice example. Okay, I've reached this pause. So if there are any questions about this first part, maybe let's talk over them now.
So, for starters, there is already one question in the chat. It was mentioned a few minutes ago, but I just read it out.
Okay.
Referring back to the example of OCD uncertainty, should be linked to a reduced sense of control over certain situations. However, symptoms show that this can almost always be overcome through repeated rituals. This suggests that there is no such thing as objective uncertainty. Instead, certainty is a subjective perception that cannot be easily measured.
Mhm.
The last part is a question. I didn't pronounce it right, so that it really was expressed.
Yes, I would agree with that. That's what we were discussing at the beginning, right?
I guess so. I'm just reading out what was written, but yeah, when you mentioned the example, I guess.
Yes. So about measuring uncertainty, of course, that's very challenging because it's quite difficult to do for a single time point, right? But you can do it, for example, by manipulating the presence of more random sources and more signal bearing sources. So you can have this kind of objective manipulation and see how people adapt to it. And if there are specific behaviors that they exhibit actually correspond to this different alatoric and epistemic components. I think there's a raised hand.
Yes, I will try again. I think now you should hear me okay, right? Yes, so in regards to this clinical statement, as a clinical psychologist myself, I think control over certain situations is sometimes understood in OCD because this ritualization of behavior, which you commonly associate, is not the only part of this behavior. And now I come to my question, because what I see in my patients usually is that uncertainty in one part for them in their mind from a, let's see, a cognitive therapy point kind of view, can usually be like transcendental and be solved by solving uncertainty in something completely unrelated, going towards like self-fulfilling prophecies and whatever, where the uncertainty itself of the horrible outcome of whatever, somebody dying or whatever might happen, is not actually the uncertainty which is at the point of this ritual. It's something completely else, which still gives the idea of reducing uncertainty, even though the people already know it's completely unrelated.
Yeah, I'm really glad for this question. Actually, now I understand. This is a great point, and this comes to the fact that people hold a certain beliefs, right? And so I completely agree with this point that it's not about uncertainty necessarily per se, but it's about the beliefs that people hold about them, about about the external world, I should say, right? So big part of it is trying to understand how people form these internal models, actually, because by definition, if you have a wrong internal model of the world, right? What you're effectively doing is you are kind of you're creating dissonance between some reality and what the beliefs that you hold, essentially. And this can lead to situations where you are basically overfitting certain observations, right? So you have an observation, somebody gives you the look, and maybe that leads you to develop a whole belief about what they might be thinking, for example, right? Is that sort of what you meant?
Yeah, kind of. And also, in regards to these beliefs, that basically the belief we can see from the outside, which is why I really like that you also added the questionnaire, because in clinical psychology, measuring something like uncertainty has no real practical value, as you just described. The latent structure behind it and the amount of interpretation which is possible in the end can't be really reduced, at least at this point, to a sort of, I always phrase it as like a scientific psychology in regards to a clinical, practical psychology, where, of course, we can talk about the great models people have devised, but in the end, in the session, I have to explain to a patient why she's doing this or that, and these models don't really add up to what is being shown from the patient.
Yeah, I agree with this. I actually, this is a bit of a reveal, but I'm actually working on a paper right now where I kind of argue in a similar direction, essentially, because I think there's a bit of a focus on, particularly in the clinical psychology, on uncertainty, but there's less focus on the sort of, you can study uncertainty, but it's about uncertainty of what, right? So then it's about the model you hold, the beliefs that you hold, essentially, and whether they are kind of reflective and true generating causes of the observations. And so there's kind of sometimes more discrepancy. And I think a lot of recent papers are starting to kind of spot this in more complex paradigms where people have to learn, some latent structures or some graphs, which start tapping into this idea that, there's something about the way we infer structures and we infer knowledge generally that's perhaps altered in some of these mental health issues.
So by now I don't see another question, but I would have one. I mean, I guess it's pointing a bit in future directions of this talk, probably. But especially referring to this information-seeking behavior, right? If we think about the bodily response, it should basically also be reflected in a probable decrease of heart rate. But if we think the other way around, if we have a situation where a person is really stressed or has had to run and heart rate is increased in general due to the bodily response to the stressor, right? Is there anything known how this affects uncertainty in general? So is uncertainty harder to reduce in those certain situations?
I guess it depends about uncertainty about what. What do you mean exactly? Right? Because you're giving an example where there could be different causes for having elevated heart rate, right? So there's some evidence from what I remember, but not in the context of uncertainty. I don't really know of any work that would have looked into this specifically, to be honest. Yeah. Also, the story between, or the relationship between uncertainty and physiological responses is, it's an evolving one, I would say, because especially in the context of these kind of very simple paradigms that people use, like fear conditioning, there's a lot of focus on the aversive component and less focus on the fact that as a byproduct, there's fluctuations in uncertainty in some of these tasks as well. And we have some data, or others have also published data that, for example, physiological like skin contact responses and pupil responses are actually quite reflective or sensitive to the uncertainty. Like if you take, for example, the fact that uncertainty changes over time, let's say if the environments shift, and they seem to be quite sensitive to uncertainty, even sometimes more than to how threatening the situation actually is.
Thank you very much. There are a few more questions. There are raised hands, but I'll first read out the question in chat because I think that was the first. So Emilia asked, first of all, great talk. Thank you for all of the information. Can you directly compare uncertainty to IOU to some degree to a healthy natural anxiety level versus anxiety disorders? And if not, and as someone coming from more neurobiology and circuit studies, I'm wondering if there have been studies performed on what brain areas and mechanisms are underlying uncertainty perception and IOU.
Yes, so interesting question. So from what I know is that there's a general idea. I'm not gonna say that's always supported, but there's a general idea that so being able to cope with uncertainty, it's a positive aspect, right? And this is also aligning with the fact that being somewhat anxious or having some form of vigilance and anxiety is a positive thing because it motivates behavior, it motivates information seeking, it motivates other aspects. But perhaps there's a point where we've become too uncertainty averse. We don't like and this then leads to maybe some clinical symptoms like excessive worry. So I guess the question, I'm trying to decode the question a little bit, but if the question is sort of in the direction of there being sort of a nonlinear relationship between the IOU and kind of how adaptive it is, then I would say that there's an idea, and for example, in exam stress, this has been demonstrated quite well that you need to be somewhat stressed to do well at an exam. But in general, we don't really see this too much in the data, to be honest. We see quite often that it's somewhat increasing linear relationship. So, so the people who are lowest on these scales are actually kind of performing best or are sort of least swayed by or averse to uncertainty. And the brain areas question, well, there's for example, in the domain of perceptual uncertainty, there's been a lot of research in both animals and humans who are also animals, but which is that the intraparietal sulcus is one area which has been heavily researched in terms of representing more perceptual components of uncertainty. So I think it's called LIP, basically. That's the acronym. There's some really compelling evidence from single cell or single cell recordings from monkeys showing that they specifically code for the perceptual uncertainty. For more higher order uncertainty, the one that often has come up, or I've also worked on a little bit, is the role of orbitofrontal cortex in representing more kind of the uncertainty over different possible future states. So if you, for example, have, if you're in a state where you might take 4 different actions and they might lead to different outcomes, and you want to kind of represent the entire environment. So this is sometimes called task states or task spaces. The OFC has been implicated or to be shown basically to represent these kind of spaces. That being said, there's also uncertainty signal in quite a few other regions. The amygdala is a big one because some of the when it comes to fear, for example, there are specific subpopulations within the amygdala which are more sensitive to the level of threat, and there's a separate subpopulation which is not possible to separate with, let's say, fMRI, but with like in animal studies, people have looked at this, or in some patients, where the second population basically codes for the uncertainty or ambiguity of the stimuli that you're looking at. So those are just some to mention.
So I guess there's one more question from Ondrej.
Yeah, I was just curious if you can relate uncertainty reduction to fatigue or effort in some way, or does the current research include some kind of uncertainty discounting factor that's subject specific? Because I would assume that people use more or less effort to try to reduce uncertainty, and this should be accounted for. And maybe it's exactly this inability or like a more heightened use of energy to reduce anxiety that may be characteristic of certain, pathologies rather than other, and not the uncertainty itself? Is that something that's currently discussed, or?
Yes, there are a few researchers that I know that are specifically looking into this, actually. I haven't seen the results, but there's a few paradigms that people have started going in this direction. The problem that comes with this is kind of somewhat practical, and it hurts me to say it a little bit, which is that there are quite a few things that should be studied at the same time in parallel, right? So if you're interested in teasing apart, let's say even perceived control, effort, tendency to seek information, and then with your estimation of uncertainty, then the paradigm that you would have to build to tease these things apart becomes suddenly very, very complex. That being said, we're actually trying to do this. So we're designing a task which also has effort, and it also has all these other things that I've mentioned. On top of it, you can have different behavioral tendencies, like a tendency to just repeat the same action for absolutely no other reason, just all sorts of other things. But very quickly, this becomes big. So I can send you papers about the effort that I can think of, but it's being looked into as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I would love that. Thank you.
Okay. You can drop me an email so that I don't forget. Thank you. Okay. It looks like there are no more questions. So we have reached our 20-minute mark, almost an hour into the talk, which is mostly my fault. I would like to then maybe go ahead. I don't know if you want to still have half an hour or so.
Yes, no worries.
So I have now a few examples of research studies that we have done. Maybe I won't go through all of them, but I can sort of cover at least some. So the three aspects that I was gonna talk about is sort of relates to this one of the questions, which was about the specific beliefs. And it really depends on how the individual perceives a certain environment or certain phenomena in the world. And I think this is actually something I actually just spoke to yesterday, a researcher from Israel who is really interested in this specific question. And they're specifically building, they're working with in the clinic, so they're building these kind of belief networks, so basically formalizing the initial assessment during the CBT as a kind of belief network, and then trying to work with that in terms of, how does this relate to the objective experiences, and how does this relate to uncertainty, etc. But at the level of the basic research, where we sort of mainly operate, we are quite interested in general tendencies in structural learning. So anxiety or OCD or other aspects specifically generate some biases in the way we infer structures in environments. And I will just quickly mention this one study that we have done some time ago, which was basically inspired. I included the initial inspiration here as well, which is this kind of very broad and maybe even I would actually say even a bit too broad idea that when somebody is in some form of state of aversion, so like a state of fear, through a process of, let's say, exposure therapy, we try to obviously reduce this fear, but we also know that fear tends to come back, right? So after some period of time, very often people experience maybe they were scared of a spider and this sort of comes back. And the question that has been posed in the literature for quite a while actually is what actually happens during the exposure? So are we actually targeting these aversive associations, or is there kind of a second learning process happening in parallel where the individual is actually forming now these kind of safety beliefs, but in the back of the mind there's a separate kind of memory for this more aversive state? So are these kind of memories that are being formed more kind of context dependent in a way? And I think this view that the process is only purely associative, which is, by the way, what I'm showing down here on the left side, where you would learn something is aversive and then you would actually truly unlearn it. I find it more of a straw man in a way, because it's kind of difficult to imagine a scenario where you just forget that this forgetting account is. I don't find it very plausible personally. But I can see how through the associative process the behavior responding can gradually be decreased, so it may manifest this in this more gradual manner. On the right, I'm showing this kind of alternative scenario where you are in a state where you are updating your beliefs, but maybe you're treating them as a sort of different class of experiences, but you retain the memory of previous aversion. And then you can think of this kind of return of fear phenomena as kind of basically uncertainty about which state am I currently in, or perhaps the possibility that you might be back in this aversive state 1. And this is the sort of original motivation that we started this project with, but then actually, as we were reading more and more papers, we realized that there might actually be something even broader. There might be sort of a general tendency we're interested in anxiety at that point, in find the signal or find some structure in different environments. And so we designed this experiment where essentially the people were basically just receiving shock and no shock events. And if you squint your eyes a little bit, you can see that sometimes the probability of the shocks was high, then it became quite low for a period of time, then became a high again, a low again, and high again. And so we introduced this kind of structure, which was somewhat regular, and those more vigilant in this task might be able to pick up on it. But the key thing is that we haven't really told participants that there's this latent structure. In fact, we said, here's a task, try to predict the probability of receiving a shock on the next trial as best as you can. And somewhat surprisingly, what we found is that the more anxious people, so this is a non-clinical anxious population, every time the switch would be from the high to the low probability, they were kind of faster at the way they adapted to this change. So they were sort of quicker at tracking these probabilities. And we're then thinking sort of like, okay, so is this because they're just learning faster, which would be this more kind of associative learning account, or is this because they are actually becoming more aware of this changing structure? And one kind of clue in this data that you can look at is these surprising, what we call oddball events. So these are scenarios where you are in a low probability of shock state, and suddenly you get a shock, but you get it like way sooner than you would have expected it. So if you're aware of this state or context, I use them interchangeably here, you should kind of disregard this as oddball. But if you are actually somebody who's learning from trial to trial, then you should actually be learning on this oddball event. And in this data, we found not super strong, but we found some tendency at least that the more anxious people were basically ignoring these oddball events, and they were learning more when the true shift has actually occurred, which is kind of a clue that they might be perhaps more aware of this latent hidden structure that existed in the task. And we kind of zoomed in a little bit and tried to analyze this using computational models, where we specified a model which was only able basically of this kind of gradual stepwise associative learning essentially, versus a second model which was able to dissociate somebody who has sort of this one state belief, or somebody who has inferred the structure. And in a part of the population, at least, the more anxious somebody was, the more likely they were to infer this hidden structure. So sort of jointly, this tells us a little bit about there might be some tendency in anxiety, and it might be beyond anxiety. We haven't had actually other questionnaires to infer and find these hidden structures in environments. And of course, in this context, this is a positive thing, right? Because you find a structure which is actually there. But it led us also to think about, well, would that in some scenarios, could this also lead to inferring structures which are not there sometimes? And how would this generally bias inferential processes? I'm going to skip the previous slide, but this one I will tell you a little. So this is actually another study in a much larger population, which has looked at model-based and model-free learning. So just a quick crash course into reinforcement learning. Model-based learning is basically a way where the learner has learned a transition structure between different states. So the learner explicitly hold a model of the external world and uses that to make the decisions and planning. And so in this study, which was actually two studies in independent replication, they actually found a similar sort of direction, which is that this is anxious depression. So this is actually like factor which kind of an umbrella factor for anxiety and depression has been also linked with this tendency to represent the environment as in a more model-based way, and then have as a consequence reduced uncertainty essentially about the structure. And again, this was also in a non-clinical population. So one of the predictions would be that perhaps if we then take similar tasks into anxiety patients, we might actually see that this would then become sort of maladaptive, that they would be finding structures which are perhaps not there, or perhaps they're somewhat transient. And you probably know this person. I don't have to introduce you to Julia, but we're sort of now following up on some of these ideas. Specifically, what is the what is the role of ambiguity in this inference? So one prediction we could, for example, make that if anxiety promotes this latent state inference tendencies, if we actually manipulate the ambiguity a priori, would we then see this tendency specifically in the more ambiguous scenarios? So the prediction would be that if people are fully aware of the structure, if they're explicitly told that there's this structure, we might not see any differences with anxiety, but in the more ambiguous scenarios, we would see big anxiety effects. And so what Julia has done, and she might have told you about this already, I'm not sure. We have basically an experiment where we have 3 between subject groups. People either get absolutely no instructions about the task, only just some mechanistic about how to control it. They get partial instructions. So they are told that there's some structure and they should be probably paying attention to it, or they get a full detailed overview of what the structure is. And in the actual task, this is the really fun game, especially if you like mosquitoes. What we have actually done is we've introduced actually 2 different rules, but for simplification, I will just focus on one, where basically as people go through the experiment, they have to kind of place these little nets here to defend themselves against an incoming mosquito. So they place the nets and then the mosquito kind of flies in. And so people actually have a chance to now defend themselves against this horrible creatures. Initially, we had a setup where every time the mosquito would make it through, they would actually receive a small electric shock. But we had to unfortunately exclude that option because some technical difficulties, let's just say. So for now, we sort of like the screen kind of flashes red and there's a sound, which is already quite aversive and quite unpleasant. But this is just to kind of show you the follow-up project that we're currently working on. And one aspect that I'm quite interested in is the role of the sort of gaze positioning. So when people are planning where they place the nets, how are they sort of exploring the space? And could we actually use in the future this anticipatory gaze as an index of how uncertain people actually are about the upcoming event? In a different project, which is somewhat related, but you will see in a quite different. We're also asking a question of what's the actual process of inferring these hidden states. So let's say we find that there is this tendency to find different rules in anxiety. What is the actual information processing that occurs. So in this project, we're looking at this from a perspective of kind of memory, where first people go through an experiment and they are receiving like trial by trial outcomes. And so as they are learning, as they're going through the learning experience, maybe they haven't quite inferred that there is some hidden structure. Maybe they infer it sort of here, or maybe they infer it here, or maybe here. But perhaps also it's kind of a memory component that they might kind of remember the more representative aspects, or maybe even the more surprising aspects a bit better. And so we can basically specify different models for different hypotheses as to what will be the actual representation of the task once they have completed the task. And here I'm just showing one of the hypotheses. This is the case where they have memory for the more stable and more representative events that have occurred. And if you plot like a marginal distribution of this, you will see that this will have these sort of two peaks. So the idea is that if this is their kind of belief at the end of the task, could we then sort of then could this lead to kind of development of a higher order model of the world, right? So in this case, it's a super simple model which only has these two states, but we also can extend it later to more complex aspect. And the one interesting thing that happens once you have inferred this model, once you have now this kind of understanding of how the environment operates, is that it will kind of change how you think about your past experiences in a way. So for example, instead of having this sort of memory in the top, you will just have much more certain and clear idea that there were these switches, and this will impact both how you remember things, but also how you plan things and predict things for the future. So what we're doing here is a similar kind of setup. There's again a circular array, but this time with zombies, not mosquitoes. And in this project, there's again some kind of defense. So this is how we basically get a behavioral readout. But on some trials, after let's say 1 month, people are asked to actually travel back in time. So this kind of allows us to say, well, first of all, it allows us to measure when people actually infer these hidden states based on the distributions. But it also allows us to say, well, when you were in day 10 or 20 or whatever, this was your belief. Then you've had these different experiences. And now if you travel back, what are your beliefs about day 10, let's say? And this kind of going back in time allows us to explicitly look at, once you've inferred the state, how does that kind of reorganizes your past experiences? Okay. Maybe any questions at this stage, because I will move to a slightly different topic.
There
Okay.
is one question.
Not the question, or kind of the question. Have you looked into like actually depressed patients? Because like in this whole thing, I was just thinking about Aaron Beck's concept of cognitive. I don't actually know the German word, the English word, Verzerrung, distortions.
Distortion.
Because Aaron Beck has a whole model where depression is basically based on cognitive distortions in memory and allocation and attribution. And a lot of the things you were just talking about are basically fundamental premises of that model. So maybe it would be an interesting way of further going into this topic, because I think there's a questionnaire which tests for it. So maybe it would be prone to actually be a viable population to do this again. If you need another idea for publication.
I think that's actually interesting because so first of all, I don't know about this theory actually. I mean, I've heard about this at some point, but it's been a long time ago. Maybe if you could send it to me later, that would be really helpful for me to have a look at. Because in general, would be, as you say, quite similar. And one aspect that I also want to mention here is that because very often when we look at these kind of questionnaires and we measure mental health through questionnaires, anxiety and depression, they are often lumped together. They shouldn't be, but they're often lumped together. But some of the questionnaires measuring anxiety, like the STAI, for example, has actually been linked much more to depressive symptoms than anxiety symptoms. So people who study neuroticism and anxiety specifically, they really are always very discouraging about using this specific questionnaire. And this is actually the one that I've used in the study that I told you about a moment ago. So it could be that we're actually measuring more depressive aspects than anxious aspects. But actually, that's something that we're also kind of trying to look into a bit more. But yeah, thank you. That's super helpful. And so in line with this work, I want to stay in this realm of inference. So how do we infer, what caused a certain aspect? And I want to go back to this idea of underfitting and overfitting. But this time, not so much at the level of like some generative random sources, but in terms of causal attributions, right? So let's say that you're experiencing a headache, and the reasons are two. There are two reasons. You didn't drink enough water and you banged your head. But maybe you attribute the headache only to one of them, or maybe you consider too many different causes or causes which are wrong, right? And this kind of generates a situation where you could be sort of having too simple model of the world or too complex model of the world. And this is actually something we can specifically study. And surprisingly, this hasn't really been looked into, even though for me, the more I think about it, this seems to be really something that is much more common when we think about the sort of clinical phenomenology of anxiety and mental health in general. It's a lot about this kind of attribution, like what do I consider to be meaningful, and the tendency to find, too complex causal models, for example, in anxiety when we worry, for example. To address this, we actually we developed a task specifically based on some old literature from the 80s called occasion setting. I'll try to walk you through it very quickly, but first I will just introduce you to the big picture idea, which is that we can basically have these different environments where we can manipulate how many of these blobs, which are what we call contexts or causes, how many of them are actually relevant for predicting certain outcomes. So there can be some which are, meaningfully contributing, and some which are still, producing some. They're still active and there, but they are not really contributing to the outcomes. And the purpose in this game or in this task is for the participant to infer how many and which of these causes are actually relevant. And this creates a nice kind of testing environment, because we can then have environments where there are only 2, 3, or 4 of these 5 different causes, and then simply look at how many of them did the participant find or treat as relevant. And then we can zoom in and say, well, which of those did they get right and which they got wrong? And this allows us to kind of measure a few things. One is the overall complexity, right? Like, does anxiety make us infer or attribute causality which to irrelevant sources, essentially? And also, we can then look at how these biases, what drives these biases. And there can, for example, be one aspect is that some of the blobs might be, the modulation they exert on the outcomes is quite high, it's quite positive. So if this pink potato is active, and then the target is the star, this could be, let's say, positive. So do people kind of focus on the causes which lead to positive outcomes? But you can also imagine a scenario where the potato itself, so it's not a potato, it just looks like a potato, it's, let's say, something that you really don't like. Like maybe you really hate green color, right? But that's completely irrelevant to the contextual modulation, to causal modulation it has in this specific game, right? So people might be kind of assuming causality based on other associations they have with the stimuli. So we can also look at what I call it misattribution bias, even though that's not really the best name yet. I'm still finding the good one. Where we can actually associate these different causes themselves with positive and negative outcomes. And then we can see whether that actually impacts how people then treat them in terms of the causality. And we have some initial piloting data on this. We actually found that it was about 60 people. We found that broadly, if we kind of pool the different internalizing symptoms, so we had a few questionnaires on anxiety, depression, and obsessive and compulsive tendencies. If we pull them, we find that generally, the more somebody was loading heavily on the internalizing symptoms, the more complex models they were actually finding. So they had a tendency to find more causes as being relevant rather than irrelevant. And this is something that we're currently developing and pursuing. And there will be actually some internship opportunities. And I would also like to have a PhD project in this direction. So if that's something you're interested in, definitely get in touch. Let me check the time very quickly. Yeah, I'll try to wrap up in the next few minutes. So the other aspect of cognition and inference is because we cannot always learn about every aspect of the world. We have to deal with the uncertainty and try to generalize patterns which repeat. And in this study, we looked at how people basically form beliefs under conditions of uncertainty. And to do this, they were playing this sort of game where there was a little storm in the middle. But they could only see the probability of the storm on one of the fields, but they couldn't see what's around it. And then they had to navigate this little boat to reach the safety of the island. And the whole cover story was that they are carrying some puppies, and the puppies can fall into the water if there's a storm, etc. But the key idea is that we can measure sort of how much people generalize around the storm, and that how much that actually impacts their behavior. So if you hold a certain belief, how does this translate into your avoidance behavior? And the perhaps even more interesting question that we looked at in this task is, well, if you actually avoid something, how does that in turn actually impact your beliefs, right? Because if you have not received any information and you have maybe some false beliefs about certain location, then you might actually be in a situation where, this kind of spins off even more, right? So you might develop even more exaggerated beliefs, even though you haven't really experienced any feedback. And actually, we did find this in this study. We find that if people actually visit certain location, they rate it a bit more lowly, so they are more close to the true probability. And if they avoid it, they tend to be a little bit higher. I will kind of skip this bit, I think. This is mainly just to give you an idea that we're also testing some ideas around uncertainty in patient populations. This is actually a study which has both depression and anxiety, social anxiety disorder specifically. And it's looking at the ambiguity of facial perceptions. And big take home is, of course, that socially anxious individuals tend to perceive negative emotions in even relatively positive stimuli. Yeah, and I will kind of wrap up here. I will just mention there are a few things that we are doing now in the lab and the directions where we're moving. Particularly trying to build things that take the complexity of the data that we can collect into account. So rather than just having, questionnaire and like a single computational parameter, to work with things like real world data, things like with LLMs, for example, now we can relatively easily look at derive basically multivariate embeddings of language, and then we can sort of see how in this kind of complex multivariate analysis, if there are any like kind of latent dimensions which are specifically linked to each other. So this kind of large scale analysis, it's something that hasn't really been done. And particularly the contribution of kind of tasks and this kind of typical psychological experiment hasn't really been tested, because one of the things that a lot of people fear secretly, I would say, in psychology is that the tasks don't really capture well aspects of real world cognition and psychiatric conditions. And I think that's actually something that should be tested. We're also interested in longitudinal tracking, so not something we're doing at the moment, but we don't really know basically anything about how does uncertainty aversion fluctuate over time, and if it does, and to what degree it's stable. So that's something that we'll be looking at. And then I've pasted this picture as a game which only exists as this picture that you see right now. It's only an idea. But at some point, we would like to develop a series of these kind of gamified tasks, which with AI, actually, it's relatively straightforward. I wouldn't say that, but it's easier than it was 2 years ago, where we actually try to look at these more integrative approaches. So how do, for example, control or effort relate to uncertainty and these kind of inferential problems? So the goal is there. And this specific game is targeted at youth, so children basically, who would be then playing these different mini games, hopefully being somewhat entertained in the process. Okay, I'm gonna pause here. Maybe there are any questions, and then there were a few questions that were asked beforehand, so I can kind of go over them and mention them.
So I don't see a question in the chat right now, but I would have one, because I do think the concept or the use of the concept in your specific research regarding multimodal integration and so on would be interesting. Do you have any hypotheses about what could what could come out if you use Granger causality to interpret whether one or the other is driving a certain process, and if you already know or have a few pilot data sets maybe that you base your hypothesis on?
Yeah, there are some longitudinal studies that have looked at how different aspects drive each other. But for example, let's just take anxiety and uncertainty to be like, or even more specific, worry and intolerance of uncertainty. Often the studies that I've seen have this sort of bidirectional relationship, because it's just based on a specific window, right? I did run a longitudinal study myself. I don't have the results here, but there was an interesting aspect, which is that so this was during COVID, when people were, of course, there was the first wave, everybody got really worried about it. Then there was the summer where nobody knew anything about COVID, and then there was the autumn, which was perfectly predicted by all the models, that the COVID is going to come back, basically, and that actually is what happened. So throughout this entire period, we basically sampled about 300 people in the UK to get a sense of this, of exactly what you're asking. So what does uncertainty aversion predict? Worry or etc. And basically what we found, if I remember correctly, this has been a while since it's not published yet, but I'm still working on it, is that worry was a big driver of behavioral avoidance, for example, but also of information seeking, and also increased uncertainty perception. So there was kind of a unidirectional relationship between worry and these different measures, but they were not really feeding back into worry, while between themselves, so for example, avoidance and uncertainty perception, there was a kind of bidirectional relationship between them, roughly. So there seems to be something about worry being sort of preceding these other aspects. But I should also say that the time window here that we had was about 2 weeks, so it's also has to be taken with a pinch of salt.
Thank you very much.
I can sort of address, because these questions, they were about slightly different aspects, but there was a common theme, I thought, which was sort of like, can we, are there individual differences in how well we tolerate uncertainty, and can we do something about it? We have a clinician in the audience who will probably tell you that yes. In fact, as part of the CBT, there's a module for intolerance of uncertainty specifically. But even sort of unspecific CBT or ACT have been shown to actually improve uncertainty intolerance in anxiety patients. So even if you don't sort of tailor the therapy to uncertainty, you still see really big reductions in intolerance of uncertainty, IUS specifically. It's this paper that I pasted here. And of course, in the context of like financial decision making or health decision making, there's loads of work on how can we sort of train ourselves to cope better with uncertainty. Very often it kind of focuses a little bit, especially in the finance direction, it focuses a little bit too much on the kind of like more rational kind of approaches, like remind yourself, not the emotional component, which actually I think the emotional component of uncertainty probably plays a big role. Yeah, there's a raised hand.
Yes, maybe I can also give some further insight from practical work regarding CBT and uncertainty. I think what people have to realize, it's not necessarily that we want to reduce uncertainty or whatever, but in the broader scope of CBT, part of it is creating a model so people can understand how their symptoms actually originated. And in that model, these biases I've posted in the chat and the model back proposed basically are a foundation for how depressive symptoms even arise. And usually in practical work, the biggest part is not reducing uncertainty, but showing people that the intolerance of uncertainty is actually making them depressed, and is basically holding up a model which is built on reducing uncertainty in not the wrong way, but using the wrong way to get there, which is where these biases come in, or these distortions in how we see the world. So I think to all these questions where I'm usually like, oh, the models don't really fit the real world. In this case, they do, because uncertainty, even though we don't go into the model fit of uncertainty in day-to-day work, but basically in the back of our minds, when we create these models with the patients and these individual models, there's always a part of us saying, okay, is this person seeing the world as it is from a constructive point of view, or is their bias causing them to see the world in a worse way?
Exactly. Yeah. I think I in the second part of the talk, I try to focus more on this as well. But this is actually inspired by also, or talking to clinicians, right? That it is exactly about the perception of the world and the understanding. And I very much sympathize with this view, because I think sometimes there's this kind of real focus on like, oh, it's just this aversion to uncertainty. But I'm with you that actually it might be less so about uncertainty, but what it relates to, I think, still is what I opened with, which is this kind of mismatch between perceiving kind of meaning in what's actually not so meaningful, and sometimes the other way around, right? Like, this idea which originates in misperception of or causal attributions is also reflected in like our beliefs about how the world works, right? So it's kind of also linked to uncertainty in that way, that there's basically this sort of mismatch eventually. But yeah. Yeah, I think there was some questions to almost. Yeah, there's some work here on this question about the more like development, like does our baseline tolerance stayed since childhood? I guess the answer is I couldn't really find any data. I didn't know the answer, but I looked around today and I couldn't really find much data, but I found some interesting data about kind of risk preferences across lifespan, which tend to be that we tend to be more risk seeking or like accepting when we are younger, and then as we get older, we get a bit more averse to uncertainty in general. But there's definitely a sort of deliberate training one can do to sort of be better at coping with unpredictability. Yeah. Then there were a few questions, but I think I would just keep these for now unless somebody, whoever wrote them, wants to ask, because I think they were mainly quite a variety. And one thing that I will actually mention, sorry, is that uncertainty also is a positive thing. It's not always a negative thing, right? So today, actually, in Ireland, they're playing a football game, and the whole country is very excited about it. And it's the first time that Ireland would get into some World Cup, and everybody has been coming to me today with this excitement because they are playing Czech Republic, where I come from. So everybody's been coming to me with this excitement, and of course, then the unpredictability or the future uncertainty is making everyone very like excited because there's this possibility of something happening. And I think that's actually a great point that somebody has written, which is that of course, and things if things were perfectly predictable, it would be quite a boring world to be in, essentially, right? So this unpredictability or like also makes things kind of fun for us. And I think that's completely true. I guess one thing that might happen with more anxious mind is that when there is an unpredictable situation, they might sort of apply a model which leads to the worst kind of outcomes or situations within that uncertainty, right? So there might be this kind of uncertainty might act as this kind of magnifying glass for our worst fears, essentially, which is what I kind of see that role very much in particularly in like an anxious thought. But yes, I think I will sort of wrap up here. I have already mentioned I'm actually now sort of starting my lab, so I'm sort of open to any internships. There are some PhD opportunities as well, and so if these topics are of interest to you, then get in touch, and we can chat about that as well. But yes, otherwise I will just complete here.
So thank you very much. I'll just slowly take over. And in case somebody would like to ask another question, please feel free to raise your hand or just unmute yourself. And then, yes. Otherwise, we'll just finish. So I hope
save the chat because I wasn't able to follow the links, but maybe if we could.
I saved them. I can send them to you.
Okay.
So right now I don't see any questions, so I just proceed. Ondrej teased a little bit and also told you a little bit about it. So yeah, there will be vacancies, PhD positions. Probably you could do an internship there. But also what he informed us about is that there will be a journal club likely about the topic of uncertainty. So if you're interested in that, you might also like to reach out and maybe have a look at the socials within the next days. We mentioned them at this slide. These slides will, of course, as always, be shared with you so you can use them and use the links. And yeah, with that, I'd like to thank you for attending today, for asking wonderful questions. And as usual, a little quick advertisement of the next Neuro Talk Evening that is very, very different from this one. It will be given by Angelika Dannert, who is at the LMU Munich and also won the prize of the German Association for Research like 2 years ago, and she will speak about modeling neurodegenerative diseases with human stem cells from iPSC neurons to 3D brain tissue models. And if you would like to maybe rewatch the talk that was given today, or also look into a few of those studies that were mentioned and you didn't know them, this talk will also be published as well as the slides within the next days or weeks, depending on our current workload. And yeah, with that, I'm finished and wish all of you a wonderful evening.